Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing amazing. We got Old Britannia. This is called The War Aims of Each Nation in World War One. This video will have both parts. They're separate videos, but we're going to connect the two of them. So I'm not sure, what this is really going to be about. I guess, like, when we say aims, obviously, World War One began in Sarajevo, and it really just became what like Bismarck said was what did Bismarck say? Bismarck said something about a spark. My brain's not very caffeinated right now, but Bismarck said it was basically it was something that was about, it was doomed. The nationalism, the militarism, the alliances, the things that we've heard a million times before culminated, and this was created out of that because of protecting alliances and the militarism, and then posturing, etc. And then the technology really exacerbated this war. The technology is why there was so many deaths, because of the chemical warfare, because of the machine guns, because of the rapid militarized units that just ran through parts of Western Europe. So let's hear what Old Britannia's got to say.
In 1918, the First World War came to a close with a decisive victory for the Entente. The next year, a series of settlements were forced upon the defeated Central Powers, the most famous of which was the Treaty of Versailles, which saw Germany stripped of these lands. 18 months earlier, Germany had imposed its own peace treaty on Russia, in which they took control of a vast swathe of Eastern Europe.
So, is this not preliminary aims? I might be misjudging this. I was thinking it's preliminary aims. So I guess is this, and maybe this is an intro, so I should just watch and shut up. But it's either preliminary aims, or it's like, what did they want to get out of the war, post-war?
Yet these treaties were products of the circumstances in which victory was achieved. For the Entente, it was after the war had become about self-determination and was increasingly dominated by the United States. For Germany, it was only after Russia had begun to disintegrate as a coherent state. Neither any Entente or Central Power got to ever truly fulfill their desired peace plans, or their vision of a post-war world. This video then will look at the war aims of each of the 5 great powers that entered the First World War in 1914, how they changed, and how they imagined a post-war world.
Okay.
The first power we'll look at is Germany, the principal combatant for the Central Powers and arguably the nation with the most radical vision for a restructuring of the European order. German aims fluctuated throughout the conflict, often depending on who dominated the government at the time. Nevertheless, there were serious proposals on what concessions Germany desired from the war. The first of these is the most infamous, the September Programme, envisaged in 1914 when it seemed like Germany was on course for a quick victory. This was about as Carthaginian a peace as was imagined by any nation in the war. In the west, Germany was to annex resource-rich areas in France such as the Brie region. Belgium was to be turned into a puppet state in control of the Channel ports, so as
Is that like historic Flanders for that area? I think so. I'm not sure.
to threaten Britain. Perhaps the most striking thing about this proposal is the remarkable similarity in the east to the land Germany actually took in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk almost 4 years later. It arguably reflects the fact that for most German diplomats, the main war was in the east, where the greatest spoils were to be had for Germany in terms of resource-rich land, though Germany's war aims in Russia did always remain far more fluid than its demands in the west. Evidently, the September Programme was never implemented, at least in the west, as Germany's armies were defeated at the Battle of the Marne. The subsequent descent into trench warfare meant German diplomats saw a favourable negotiated peace rather than total victory as the main aim of Germany's war effort instead. For this, we'll take the often vague suggestions of the German Chancellor until 1917, Bethmann Hollweg. Bethmann was no pacifist, but he was one of the more lucid German policymakers and understood Germany would have to compromise in some aspects. He never offered a set series of proposals, but regarding Western Europe, he envisaged small border corrections with the annexation of Brie and Luxembourg. The terms discussed with the Belgian king in a proposed separate peace in 1916 included the demilitarisation of Belgium and economic dependence on Germany. In the east, his dreams weren't as expansionist as outlined in the September Programme, but still aimed for Poland and Lithuania to be declared as independent states.
Interesting.
Even so, he did at various points ponder a separate lenient peace with Russia so as to focus on the West. Bethmann was ultimately ousted in 1917, so never got to seriously attempt a negotiated settlement. Next, there was a plan advocated by German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who had been instrumental in the creation of Germany's high seas fleet prior to the war. Tirpitz never really got near the levers of diplomatic power, but his plans are interesting for how completely delusional they are. Tirpitz saw the war as a struggle for world rather than European supremacy.
Oh. Oh.
Thus, he believed the British Empire and its command of the sea lanes was the main enemy. To defeat Britain,
I mean, to his profession, that would make sense. It's very niched in that, in the fact that he is more knowledgeable around naval warfare, naval supremacy versus, like, I guess, a territorial expansion on land.
he advocated signing a white peace with Russia in the east and focusing on the western front, annexing the Channel ports to prepare for the next war, which would be a final clash against Britain. Finally,
The next war. Oh.
there was the plan of the Third OHL, dominated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, in case of victory in 1918. This was after peace had been made with Russia in the March of that year. Ludendorff saw Russia's defeat only as a preliminary to total victory in the West. In reality, though, there were never any concrete proposals, but we can assume it would have been similar to the September programme. Almost all of these plans came attached with the proposal for a German-led economic union with the rest of Europe that would
Whoa. A German-led economic union. This seems so familiar to the one that Napoleon proposed, where they kept Britain out of it.
provide a market for German goods and exclude Britain, generally known as Middle Europa, based on a book written in 1915. Though it wasn't actually an authoritative policy statement, the common theme here is that this was not a war of survival for Germany. Even supposed compromise pieces aimed to ensure Germany was supreme on the continent for the foreseeable future.
Just the parallels. I definitely need to study more about World War One. It seems like there's a lot of parallels between Napoleonic, like Emperor Napoleon, so 1803 or something like that. Post Napoleon, Russian peace, Europe is what they were looking for.
In the end, this refusal to compromise meant Germany ended up being completely defeated in 1918, with even Brest-Litovsk being annulled by the Entente. Of all the combatants in the First World War, France had the single clearest war aim, the reclamation of Alsace-Lorraine. The territory had been amputated from France in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the desire to reclaim the territory had stimulated revanchist sentiment in the country since. The territory was so vital that despite the fact German armies sat deep inside French territory for most of the war, French diplomats almost totally refused to contemplate any negotiated peace that didn't include Alsace. France was also motivated more than any nation by hostility to Germany, which had replaced France as Europe's preeminent power in 1871. Consequently, French war aims were also shaped around finding ways of limiting German power. These ranged from the most hardline stances, that Germany should be Balkanized,
Whoa. I mean, it was cut up a little bit, though,
to the comparatively moderate position that the imbalance between Germany and France should be redressed. One way this could be done was by annexing more German territory. The French for much of the war maintained designs on the coal-heavy region of the Saarland, which would be annexed to increase France's industrial strength. More extensive plans advocated the setting up of a rump Rhinish state to provide security for France, whilst in the early days of the war the French military even considered recreating France's natural borders by annexing all of the left bank of the Rhine. There were other more minor colonial claims, particularly affecting Syria, but
Syria.
ultimately French war aims were almost solely focused on weakening Germany and strengthening France in the European balance of power. In the end, France would reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, but would have to settle for a demilitarised Rhineland and the separation of the Saarland as a League of Nations mandate, eventually to be annexed back into Germany. Russia was a nation that was in an almost perpetual crisis of self-confidence over what the war was actually being fought for.
Yeah, Russia's probably the anomaly here out of all these five great nations of this age. just because of their internal struggle.
The initial casus belli had been defending a Slavic brother state, Serbia, from annihilation, but as the body count began stacking up, this wasn't a particularly sellable point to the Russian public. When Russia went to war, the Supreme Commander Nikolai Nikolaevich published a manifesto promising the creation of a Polish state within the Russian Empire. The aim was to do this by joining Congress Poland with German and Austrian Polish regions.
First, I know Russian plans for Poland always seem to be been quite vague, so this is the best I come up.
This would serve the more general Russian aim of weakening Germany and destroying Austria as a
That's a fit. Wouldn't that be like a similar Poland that we saw post Congress of Vienna?
competitor in the Balkans. The Russians never went as far though as to specify the complete destruction of the Habsburgs, for fear that the collapse of this multi-ethnic empire would encourage the Russians' own minorities to rebel. Despite these territorial aims,
it's like a balance of power continuously, because obviously Austria-Hungary has, the Slavs, they have Hungarians, they have Romanians, they have, Germans as well, of course. But the Russian Empire is way more multi-ethnic. Whether you can just go as far up, far east, as far south, like it's vast. We know this. But yeah, that's an interesting thought, right? Because obviously you could have somehow flipped Austria-Hungary on its head, but by doing that, is there repercussions that could propulse through the continent similar to 1848?
there was a degree of Germanophilia running throughout the Russian elite, who saw the conflict less as a clash between nation-states and more as a clash between the liberal West and the autocratic East that Russia just happened to be on the wrong side of. This view was silenced by the entry of Russia's perennial foe, the Ottoman Empire, into the war. The foreign minister Sazonov was able to extract a commitment from Britain and France that Russia would take Constantinople at the end of the war, formerly the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which Russia claimed to be a successor of.
Yeah, that's a crazy thought that if that could ever have been a thing, that would have just culminated to so much more future violence. I think though, because that economic zone is just so vital for modern Turkey, obviously. But what an interesting hypothetical world we would live in if this was the case. Wow.
The city would also finally give Russia access to the Mediterranean. After the war became an almost holy endeavour against the Muslim Turks, a separate peace with Germany was never seriously discussed, and Russia remained committed to the war effort until the Bolshevik Revolution. The overthrow of the Tsar in the February Revolution did change Russia's war aims, but I won't go into them here. In sum then, Russian war aims looked something like this. In the end, the October Revolution meant Russia instead signed a humiliating peace treaty, only undone because of an Entente victory in the West. Austria's war aims were what had brought about the conflict in 1914.
Obviously, Serbia, I think they would maybe try to annex them. And then they have a lot going on internally, so maybe like preservation. I don't know. What else would they try to do?
For a decade, this multi-ethnic empire was plagued by instability in its Slavic areas because of a resurgent Serbian state that aimed to unify with these regions. Consequently, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by the Serbian Black Hand, the Austrians saw it as an opportunity to crush the Serbs once and for all. Somewhat bizarrely, the Austrians didn't actually intend to annex any of Serbia.
Oh.
They had too many Slavs already, and any more would upset the fragile balance within the Habsburg Empire. Instead, they intended to make sure Serbia would never again challenge Austria, doing this by partitioning it between Bulgaria and Greece, and then turning the rump state into a vassal. Montenegro would have its coastline taken to truly box the Serbs in. In 1915, Italy joined the war against Austria, but the Habsburg lines held thanks to the natural fortifications on the border, and thus only minor territorial adjustments were considered in the event of Italy's defeat. In 1916, Romania joined the war, but was defeated. In 1918, they signed a peace agreement that shows us Austrian aims, which mainly consisted of turning it into an economic puppet of the Central Powers. Russia was Austria's main enemy throughout the conflict.
And obviously, Russia and Austria have been like good enemies for a long time. When I say good enemies, they've been on good terms, but then they're enemies at the same time. It's insane. It's insane. It's like a constant struggle. Like they'll partition Poland together. They'll they'll work on railroads to have economic opportunity, but then they'll have continuous like opposition here or there, especially in like a lot of the eastern areas of Austria.
But proposals in case of victory were always vague. There was the so-called Austro-Polish solution to combine Congress Poland with Austrian Poland into an autonomous kingdom under Habsburg rule, but this clashed with Germany's aim for a Polish puppet state. Instead, it was generally thought Austria would share in the economic spoils of the rump states Germany carved out of Russia, something they largely achieved in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Ultimately, Austria's war aims consisted little in the way of major territorial changes, but simply what Austrian diplomats thought would secure the empire's future, something that was looking increasingly bleak as the war continued. Britain entered the war with no territorial ambitions, and this remained consistent, at least in Europe. Her main casus belli had been Germany's invasion of Belgium, and Belgian independence remained Britain's main demand throughout the war. For Britain, the destruction of the German High Seas Fleet, which challenged the Royal Navy's dominance in the North Sea, was also a crucial aim.
Yeah, I can see that. Obviously, you've had naval supremacy for the seas forever.
Those were by and large what Britain focused on, but a secondary aim was maintaining a balance of power in Europe. In practice, this meant restricting German expansion. To do this, they tied other allies' war aims, such as the French demands for Alsace-Lorraine, to their own, seeing it as a way to weaken Germany. This is not to say Britain had no territorial aims of its own. Once the Ottomans entered the war, the Middle East in particular became an area of interest to Britain. This was carved up in a treaty known as Sykes-Picot today, which gave Britain influence over these regions.
And these lines are so arbitrary, it seems.
Despite this, of all belligerents, British war aims were the most flexible, as would be seen at Versailles when Britain...
And I mean, it's not even mainland Europe, so like there's not like a direct... I mean, besides Belgium, and Belgium, of course, being created long before and sustained long before as a buffer state for France, really. But more than anything, it's not as important comparatively to like how France is going to be impacted, or how Austria or Russia or Germany is going to be impacted. I can definitely see that.
Britain attempted to facilitate an awkward compromise between the idealistic Americans and revanchist French. In the end, they were mostly achieved. Belgium was liberated, the High Seas Fleet was scuttled by the Germans, and the Middle East was partitioned, though Britain quickly reverted to its favoured method of informal empire after the peace treaty. Perhaps most importantly, however, Britain failed to preserve a balance of power on the continent. The war saw the destruction of the Austrian Empire, whilst the Russians turned insular. That left just France and Germany, and out of these, Germany was always going to be the most powerful once its strength recovered. One interesting theme in all of these is that war aims didn't necessarily get more harsh as the war went on. The September programme was about as harsh a piece as anything Germany would have come up with in 1918. What's more striking is the increasing intransigence of all belligerents to avoid coming to a settlement. As all policymakers failed to find a compromise to the crisis of 1914, so they failed to find one that could have brought the war to a close.
Wow, that's crazy. All right, we're going to do part 2 now. Let's go. All right, here's part 2.
The war raged between the five great powers of Europe, fighting for continental and potentially world supremacy. Stuck in between these behemoths were several smaller nations, each pursuing their own more limited territorial goals in the conflict.
Like, let me see how good I am at geography. You got Italy, you got Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and of course Ottoman Empire.
Since its unification in the mid-19th century, Italy's statesmen had tried to present her as a great power in the concert of Europe. In reality, it was clear she was not. Why on earth should Italy demand an increase in territory? A Russian diplomat remarked to Bismarck in 1878. Has she lost another battle? Yet, as the war got underway and Italy remained neutral, forsaking the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria as a purely defensive arrangement, she suddenly became the most attractive potential ally in Europe. This left her in a position to extract territorial concessions from both the Entente and Central powers. Germany attempted to maintain Italy's neutrality by bribing her with Austrian territory, including the Trentino region. This offer was far below Italy's expectations. Her political elite were generally made up of Anglophiles, whilst the country itself was dependent on British coal and other resources. Added to this were the territories the Entente were prepared to promise Italy, effectively everything Rome wanted from the Habsburg Empire.
Dang, like that's a renewed Venetian territory right there in the height of the Venetian Empire.
Uniting the Italian minorities in these regions. The annexation of this land would also give her uncontested supremacy in the Adriatic. The Entente further sweetened the pot with the promise of a protectorate over Albania, territory from the Ottoman Empire, and a large
Territory from the Ottoman Empire?
Subsidy from Britain. All of this proved too much of a temptation for Italian statesmen to resist, leading them to enter the war, albeit to much popular opposition, on the 23rd of May 1915. Italy was unfortunate that the Austrians, their main opposition in the conflict, held one of the best defensive positions in Europe, the Isonzo River, and so she was unable to seize most of her claimed lands until late 1918. Britain and France were consequently sceptical as to whether the Italian contribution had been worth the bribes offered to induce her into the conflict.
I'm curious, was there like a cooperation with Switzerland? Or would you be, because obviously Switzerland's neutral, but would you be able to pass through them? Or would you have to like navigate them, like circumnavigate Switzerland if you were to move troops here or there?
Especially after the Caporetto debacle had forced them to redeploy troops from the Western Front just before the German spring offensives. One British diplomat was frankly contemptuous, saying, "As for the Italians, what can you expect from a nation the majority of which would be better employed selling ice cream?"
That's harsh.
It was an unfair assessment, but shows something of the Anglo-French thought process of the peace discussions. As such, Italy was denied the full territorial compensation it had originally been promised, mainly on the Wilsonian basis of national self-determination. The result was a nation that felt cheated, and was consequently...
I mean, what did you give to what did you get? That's probably what I would suggest there.
...to become a revisionist power in the post-war world. Of all the nations that entered the First World War willingly, the Ottoman Empire's decision must be
willingly is an interesting word there.
The most bizarre. By 1914, the country was in a tenuous position, with most of its huge debt held by foreign powers. More recently, she had continued her steady decline and lost further territories in both the Balkan and Italo-Turkish wars. A sensible plan in 1914 would then have been to remain neutral and extract concessions from both sides. For the most part, the Sublime Porte agreed with this assessment, but a few high-ranking officials, led by the War Minister Enver Pasha, saw conflict as a preferable outcome. They feared that if Turkey did not pick a side, then she would be partitioned by whichever grouping was victorious. War would also provide an opportunity for the Porte to shed its immense debt burden and assert its independence from both the Entente and Central Powers, as well as avenging the seizure of 2 dreadnoughts by the British at the start of the war, paid for by popular subscription, though Britain had offered financial compensation. Territorial claims weren't actually Turkey's main concern, but it was hoped they may be able to force the Russians back from the Caucasus.
Obviously a historic enemy for them.
And so set up buffer states, thus protecting them from future Russian expansionism.
Obviously, those buffer states today are Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia.
It was also believed the defeat of the Entente may leave the door open for the domination of Persia, and perhaps even the re-establishment of Ottoman authority over Egypt. Theoretically a Turkish client until 1914, but de facto under British rule. The Turks had also made clear that if Greece joined the war, they desired the Aegean Islands, and there was some talk of retaking Cyprus and Crete.
Yeah, and obviously the Ottomans had throughout history, Ottomans had a fun island hopping campaign they continued for a long time.
Never a realistic proposition. The capitulation of Russia in 1918 did allow the Turks to move into the Caucasus, though it's debatable as to whether they or the Germans would have dominated the region had the Central Powers won. In the end, the Ottomans suffered the exact fate they joined the war to avoid. The empire was partitioned by the Entente in the wake of their victory, though under the brilliant leadership of Mustafa Kemal, they would reverse the most devastating of the territorial concessions to found the modern nation of Turkey. Serbia's rejection of an Austrian ultimatum in 1914 that would have effectively turned them into a vassal of Vienna led to the start of the war. The Serbs in 1914 were an immensely self-confident nation, having recently won 2 Balkan wars which almost doubled their territory.
What were those Balkan wars against? Were they against Austria? Were they against like another nation? I'm not too sure.
Naturally then, the war was seen as the long-awaited opportunity to seize the Slav-inhabited areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
To see, ooh, very ambitious, Serbia.
When Italy entered the war in 1915, the Entente tried to reconcile both Rome and Belgrade's designs, which clashed over areas such as the Dalmatian coast. As such, Serbia was assigned these lands at the end of the war. The Serbs failed to take this territory themselves, instead being overrun by a joint Central Powers invasion in 1915, but their war effort continued from exile. The Corfu Declaration in 1917 announced Serbia's intention to form a Yugoslav state, and, with the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the war, Serbia was apportioned even more of the former Habsburg territories than it had been promised before, even dethroning the King of Montenegro to create a Yugoslav state.
Yugoslavia.
Superficially, the war was then a major success, but the enormous devastation of Serbia, resulting in the deaths of perhaps 25% of its mobilised population, meant the victory was arguably the most bittersweet of any nation.
It's a Pyrrhic victory for sure.
Bulgaria played the part of a mercenary in the early stages of the war, waiting to see which side could stump up the better territorial offer. The Entente, particularly Britain, were largely sympathetic to the Bulgarians, and badgered Serbia into offering them territorial concessions, along with the land it had lost to Turkey in the Second Balkan War. But even though the Entente may have offered easy pickings, for the beleaguered Ottomans were unlikely to have survived a Bulgarian assault, they were nonetheless slim. The Central Powers, on the other hand, were prepared to offer the Bulgarians all of the parts of Serbia they wanted, along with a token strip from the Turks. In 1916, these aims expanded with the entry of Romania on the side of the Entente. The same happened in 1917 with the entry of Greece, which would have allowed Bulgaria to retake land lost in the Second Balkan War. There were also more far-fetched ideas about seizing an outlet on the Adriatic, but these
An expanded Bulgaria just does not even seem right, unfortunately.
were never concrete plans. Bulgarian aims looked something like this then, which, had she been able to hold them, would have ensured hegemony over the Balkans. As it was, the Bulgarian government's gamble came back to haunt them. Their population starving, their army defeated, they were stripped of further land by the victorious Entente. Romania entered the war opportunistically in 1916. She had previously been within the Triple Alliance's sphere of influence, but
And obviously you can tell like Romania is like not even half, it's probably like 60 something percent compared to like what it is today. And that is because there's a lot of Romanians living under the Austria-Hungarian Empire right now in this picture.
been edging towards the Entente's camp in the prelude to 1914. She joined the conflict when it seemed as if Austria-Hungary was on the verge of defeat. Her aims were focused on taking Transylvania and Bukovina, promised to her in the Treaty of Bucharest, which would largely unify Greater Romania. As it was, Romania joined too late to truly exploit Austrian weakness in the aftermath of the Brusilov offensive. Instead, its largely outdated army was quickly routed. Nevertheless, the nation wasn't defeated. What remained of their forces reorganised with Russian aid and proved quite effective for the rest of the conflict. But they were left in an impossible position in early 1918 when Russia exited the war.
Yeah, like what do you do in this case? You got Germany above you, you got Austria to your left, you got Bulgaria below you. It's just not a winning war at that point.
Consequently, they signed a devastating separate peace with the Central Powers, though they were given Bessarabia from the collapsing Russian state in compensation. Ultimately though, the king refused to ratify the treaty, a gamble that was to pay off later that year. In late 1918, with Habsburg power collapsing, Romania re-entered the war, so as to have a say in the post-war settlement. The Entente, keen to bring the hammer down on the Hungarians, apportioned Romania practically all of the land it hoped for. It's perhaps ironic that the only Entente power to actually be forced into making a separate peace was also the one to come out of the conflict with far more than it had first aimed for.
Very opportunistic Romania was then to jump on that, especially to be persistent, especially in such a dark side of like I said, you got Bulgaria below you, you got Austria to your left, you got Germany, like you're trapped. So good for them.
The only nation in Europe that the outbreak of war was potentially good for was Greece. The nation was only weeks off entering into a third Balkan war with the Ottomans over the Aegean islands.
Really?
And with 2 dreadnoughts soon to be arriving at Constantinople, it was unlikely to be one the Greeks would win. In theory then, it would have made perfect strategic sense for the Greeks to harness the Entente's overwhelming naval supremacy by entering the war and secure their safety by defeating Turkey. As it was, Greek politics was irrevocably divided over the war, a division for the sake of brevity I won't go into here. To oversimplify, much of the country wished to side with the Entente, reflected by the nation's brilliant Prime Minister Venizelos, who favoured a scheme proposed by the British that would have seen Greece give land to the Bulgarians, bringing them into the fold, in return for large concessions in Anatolia once the Ottomans were defeated. The king, however, with strong ties to Germany, refused to abandon neutrality. The national schism that followed paralysed Greek foreign policy, and it was not until 1917 the nation tentatively entered the conflict. They were promised major territorial concessions to do so, though notably not Constantinople, a long-held Greek desire.
Yeah, but like they haven't held that since 1453.
In the end, Greece was apportioned most of what it wanted with the Treaty of Sèvres, which, had Athens been able to hold the territory, would have fulfilled much of the Megali idea. But her attempts to impose Greek authority in Asia Minor were thwarted in the Greco-Turkish War. In almost all cases, the great powers tried to tempt these minor countries into the war with exaggerated promises of territory that only later served to get in the way of a negotiated peace. The Austrian Emperor's tentative peace offers, for example, were rebuffed in 1917 by the Entente, on the basis the Italians would understandably not be willing to abandon their war aims after so much bloodshed. Most arguably overperformed militarily, but diplomatically, the cost to either the Entente or Central Powers was probably not worth it.
Let's get to right here. I don't know about the Balkan Wars. So that's a blind spot for me. So I'm not sure, like with like Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, they're obviously having frustrations with the Ottomans here. And the Ottomans are having frustrations continuously with Russia, and then Austria. It's just there's all these alliances are just playing to favors, and it's just like a continuous chess game, and you just got to have, your timing has just got to be immaculate, and you also have to have a little bit of luck on your side, because none of this is just like, none of the war aims truly came to be unless you're Romania. Romania seems like they won. I think Romania got the best deal out of everyone here. Obviously, they suffered for a little bit, but they probably got the best deal out of any country, and that also includes the great powers. Obviously, Austria-Hungary probably lost more than anyone. Germany lost a lot. Russia lost a lot. France lost a lot of men. UK lost a lot of men. I mean, the death toll is one thing, but the legacy is another. Austria-Hungary is by far the biggest loser here. I mean, you can also say the Ottomans were a big loser, but their struggle kind of like was inevitable. But I guess you could say that about any country. But it seems like I would put Austria and then Ottoman 1 and 2, the biggest losers of this war. Germany, obviously, they got knocked down, but they obviously weren't finished. And I think Britain knew that, France knew that, which would culminate in 20 years from now. But love this channel. Go subscribe to Old Britannia. Thank you guys for being here. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out and bye-bye.